first thing my son heard that evening wasn't my voice. It was the news anchor saying my name. Authorities say retired Seattle engineer Richard Bennett saved at least 6 people after rushing into a chain reaction crash outside SeaTac Airport. Witnesses say he ignored repeated warnings and climbed into burning vehicles while waiting for firefighters to arrive. My son dropped his phone. My daughter stopped chewing halfway through dinner. And just 2 hours earlier, they had both told me to take an Uber. My name is Richard Bennett. I'm 68 years old, a retired civil engineer from Seattle, Washington. I've never liked being the center of attention. For 42 years, my wife Linda handled birthdays, holidays, neighborhood gatherings, and family dinners. I was happiest fixing a leaky faucet building, a bookshelf for the grandkids, or grilling burgers on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Linda always said I was the kind of man people depended on because I never complained. Maybe that was true. Or maybe I simply never wanted the people I loved to carry my burdens. That habit would eventually become my greatest mistake. 3 days before everything changed, I stood beside my wife's casket in Vancouver. Linda had spent the last several months there with her younger sister after her cancer became more aggressive. The treatments available in Canada offered one last possibility, and her sister insisted on helping care for her around the clock. I traveled back and forth as often as I could. Every trip became harder. Every goodbye lasted longer. Then one rainy Tuesday morning, there were no more goodbyes. Just silence. The funeral was small. Exactly how Linda wanted it. No expensive flowers, no dramatic speeches, just family, a few lifelong friends, and soft music she loved. After everyone left, I remained standing beside her grave until the cemetery groundskeeper politely reminded me they were closing. "You can come back tomorrow," he said gently. I smiled. I know. But tomorrow already felt like another lifetime. The next morning, I boarded a short flight back to Seattle. I carried one small suitcase. My wedding ring still rested on my finger. I couldn't imagine taking it off. During the flight, I stared out the window almost the entire time. Clouds drifted beneath us like fresh snow. Linda used to reach across the armrest whenever we flew. She always hated turbulence. She'd squeeze my hand and whisper, "If we survive this flight, you're buying me clam chowder." I always laughed. Now the empty seat beside me hurt more than words could describe. The plane landed at SeaTac a few minutes before 5. As passengers stood to retrieve their bags, I stayed seated. There was no reason to hurry. Nobody was waiting for me. Still, I opened the family group chat. It included me, my son Brian, my daughter Melissa, Brian's wife Karen Melissa, and a few family members who mostly shared birthday pictures and holiday plans. I typed, "My flight lands at 5 p.m. Can someone pick me up?" I looked at the screen for nearly a minute before pressing send. Part of me almost deleted it. I've never liked asking anyone for favors, especially my own children. The message showed as delivered. A minute later, Brian replied, "We're busy. Take an Uber." No hello. No, how was the funeral? No, are you okay? Just 6 words. Before I had time to think about them, another notification appeared. Melissa. "Dad, you should have planned better." I stared at those words much longer than I should have. Planned better. As though grief could be scheduled between soccer practice and business meetings. As though losing the woman I'd loved since I was 24 should have fit neatly into everyone else's calendar. My fingers hovered above the keyboard. I could have reminded them where I'd been. I could have told them their mother had been buried less than 24 hours earlier. I could have said how badly I wanted to see familiar faces instead of climbing into another stranger's car. Instead, I wrote only 2 words. No worries. I pressed send. Then I slipped my phone into my jacket pocket, not because everything was fine, but because I suddenly understood something. You can't make people care. Outside the terminal, Seattle greeted me with gray skies and cool air. A light drizzle coated the sidewalks. Travelers hurried toward waiting cars. Families hugged. Children laughed. Drivers leaned on their horns. Life continued exactly as it always had. Only mine had changed forever. I wheeled my suitcase toward the rideshare pickup area. My knees ached. Not from age, from exhaustion. I hadn't slept more than 3 hours a night in weeks. As I waited, I noticed an elderly woman struggling to lift her suitcase off the curb. Without thinking, I walked over. "Need a hand?" She smiled with relief. "Would you?" I lifted it into the trunk of her son's SUV. "Thank you," she said. "I hope someone does the same for you someday." I smiled politely. "I hope so too." A loud explosion interrupted everything. Metal slammed against metal. Glass shattered. People screamed. Every head turned toward the airport exit road. A fuel delivery truck had jackknifed after being struck by a speeding SUV. Several vehicles piled into one another. Smoke billowed into the evening sky. One sedan spun sideways before crashing into the concrete barrier. Another vehicle burst into flames. People froze. Some pulled out phones. Others backed away. Years ago, before retirement, I'd volunteered with emergency preparedness programs during earthquake drills and industrial accident training. Instinct took over before fear had a chance. I dropped my suitcase. Someone grabbed my arm. "Sir, don't go over there." I pulled free. "Call 911. They already did. Good. Then I ran. The driver's side of the burning sedan wouldn't open. A young mother inside was pounding desperately against the window. A little girl cried in the back seat. The smell of gasoline filled the air. Someone shouted, "It's going to explode." Maybe, maybe not. Either way, those people couldn't wait. I grabbed a chunk of broken concrete from the roadside. With every ounce of strength I had left, I swung it against the side window. Once, twice, 3 times. The glass finally shattered. "Cover your face," I yelled. The mother shielded the little girl as I cleared away the remaining shards. Behind me, sirens echoed in the distance. But they still sounded far away. Far too far. And all I could think was one simple thing. Linda would never forgive me if I stood there and watched someone else lose the person they loved. The first police officer who reached me grabbed my shoulder and shouted over the noise, "Sir, step back. We need you behind the barricade." "I can't," I answered, pointing toward an overturned SUV. "There's still someone inside." The officer looked where I was pointing. A hand was pressed against the cracked windshield. He didn't waste another second. "You," he yelled to 2 firefighters running toward us. "Help him." Until that moment, I hadn't realized how badly my hands were shaking. Adrenaline had drowned out everything else. Now I could feel cuts across both palms from the shattered glass. My right sleeve had been scorched where flames had licked across the doorframe. My knees ached from kneeling on broken asphalt. But none of that mattered. The firefighters pried open the SUV while paramedics rushed toward the sedan I'd helped open. Someone behind me shouted, "The little girl is breathing." I closed my eyes for one brief second. "Thank you, Linda." Nearly 45 minutes later, the scene was finally under control. Emergency vehicles surrounded the entire airport entrance. Traffic stretched for miles. A police officer approached carrying a clipboard. "Sir, what's your name?" "Richard Bennett." "Age?" 68. He looked at me for a long moment. "You should probably be in one of those ambulances." "I've had worse." He smiled despite himself. "My wife says every man over 60 says exactly that." The word wife hit me like another collision. I nodded quietly. "I just buried mine yesterday." His smile disappeared. I'm sorry." "So am I." He lowered the clipboard. "I'll keep this brief." Over the next 20 minutes, I answered questions. Which vehicle had I reached first? How many passengers had I pulled out? Had I seen what caused the crash? Several witnesses interrupted repeatedly. "No, officer," one woman insisted. "He's leaving things out." "What do you mean?" "He went back." Another man stepped forward. 3 different times. A young college student added, "Everybody else was standing there filming. He kept running back." I shook my head. "There were firefighters there." "Not at first," the student replied. "They got there because you bought everyone time." I didn't know what to say. I hadn't been keeping count. I'd simply seen people who needed help. A paramedic finally convinced me to sit on the back step of an ambulance while she cleaned the cuts on my hands. She looked to be about my granddaughter's age. "Does someone need to come pick you up?" I almost laughed. "No, you sure and I'm sure." She wrapped fresh bandages around both palms. "You've got family nearby." "I do." "Have they been notified?" "They're busy." She studied my face for a second. She was too professional to ask another question. Instead, she simply handed me a bottle of water. "I hope someone gives you a ride home." "So do I." A television reporter walked toward me with a cameraman. "Mr. Bennett." "Yes. I'm Emily Harper with King 5 News. Would you mind answering a few questions?" "I really don't think so." "You've become the central witness." "I'm not interested." "What if people want to thank you?" "They don't need to." The cameraman lowered his equipment. Emily softened her voice. "We've spoken to firefighters. So, they said several people would likely have died if you hadn't acted." I looked toward the flashing emergency lights. "I'm glad they're alive." "That's all you want to say?" "Yes." She nodded respectfully. "Fair enough." She turned away without pressing further. I appreciated that. Linda always admired people who accepted no as a complete sentence. Because airport traffic had become impossible, the police drove me to a nearby hotel where stranded travelers were gathering. One of the officers insisted, "You shouldn't be wandering around tonight. It's only a few miles from my house, and the roads are closed." He wasn't wrong. I checked into a modest hotel less than 10 minutes from the airport. Nothing fancy. Just a quiet room with beige walls, a small television, and a window overlooking the parking lot. For the first time all day, there was silence. I set Linda's small travel bag on the dresser. Inside was the blue sweater she'd insisted on bringing, even though she never wore it. It still smelled faintly like her perfume. I sat on the edge of the bed holding it. That was when I finally cried. Not because of the accident, not because my hands hurt, but because there would never again be another text from Linda asking if I'd landed safely. Across town, my children knew nothing about where I was. Brian had just finished dinner with his wife Karen and their teenage son. Melissa was helping her youngest daughter finish a science project. Neither had watched the news yet. Brian glanced at the family group chat. Dad hadn't answered after writing, "No worries." Karen frowned. "Did your dad make it home?" "I'm sure he grabbed an Uber." "You could have picked him up." Brian sighed. "I had a client dinner." Karen didn't argue. She simply nodded, but her expression lingered longer than he liked. About an hour later, Brian's phone began vibrating. First his neighbor, then an old college friend, then a former coworker, finally his boss. "Brian." "Yeah, I just saw something on television." "What? Is your father Richard Bennett?" Brian frowned. "Yeah, why? You need to turn on Channel 5. "What happened?" "Just turn it on." The line went dead. Brian picked up the remote. The television was already covering the airport accident. Footage from a news helicopter filled the screen. Smoke, fire, ambulances. Then the camera zoomed in. A gray-haired man wearing a dark jacket was climbing through the shattered window of a burning sedan. Brian leaned closer. "No," Karen whispered. "Brian." The news anchor continued. Authorities say retired Seattle resident Richard Bennett repeatedly entered dangerous crash zones before first responders fully secured the scene. The screen changed. There I was, standing beside an ambulance with blood running down my sleeve. The reporter continued. Witnesses described Bennett as remarkably calm despite the danger. Karen slowly turned toward her husband. "Wasn't that—" Brian couldn't answer. His throat had closed. Across the city, Melissa received nearly the same phone call. Her friend Diane said only one sentence. "I think your dad's on every television station in Seattle." Melissa laughed nervously. "What?" "I'm serious." She turned on the television. Seconds later, she covered her mouth. The footage replayed again and again. Then the producers displayed a screenshot from the family group chat timeline investigators had reconstructed through airport security records. Mr. Bennett had reportedly arrived from Canada earlier this evening after attending his wife's funeral. Melissa's eyes filled with tears. Her mother. She had been so consumed by deadlines, children's schedules, and everyday life. She hadn't stopped to imagine what that lonely flight home must have felt like. Then another image flashed across the screen. Me, walking alone through the airport terminal, carrying one suitcase. No family waiting. Melissa whispered, "Oh, Dad." My phone remained face down on the hotel nightstand. I hadn't looked at it once. I didn't hear the vibrations, didn't see the missed calls, didn't notice the flood of text messages arriving one after another. For the first time in years, everyone wanted to know where I was. I woke up just before 6 the next morning. For a few peaceful seconds, I forgot. I forgot I was in a hotel instead of my own bedroom. I forgot Linda was gone. I forgot about the airport. Then I reached toward the empty side of the bed. My hand touched nothing but cold sheets. Reality came back all at once. I sat there for a long time, staring out the window as the Seattle sky slowly turned from gray to pale blue. The television remained off. I had no interest in seeing myself on the news. I'd spent 40 years solving problems behind the scenes. Recognition had never been part of the job. Linda used to tease me about that. "You'd rescue the whole neighborhood," she'd say, then sneak away before anyone could thank you. She wasn't wrong. My phone buzzed again, and again. I finally picked it up. 43 missed calls, dozens of text messages, Brian, Melissa, Karen, neighbors, former coworkers, even people I hadn't spoken to in years. The first message from Brian read, "Dad, where are you?" The second, "Please call me." Then, "I'm sorry." Melissa's messages weren't much different. Dad, please answer. We're worried. Please don't be alone. I stared at the screen without replying. Not because I wanted revenge, not because I wanted them to suffer. I simply wasn't ready to talk. There are moments when grief leaves no room for conversation. This was one of them. Around 8 o'clock, there was a knock on my hotel room door. When I opened it, I found the young reporter from the night before. Emily Harper. She looked almost embarrassed. I'm sorry to bother you. How did you find me? The officer who drove you here didn't tell us. The hotel manager recognized you from television after the morning news. I see. I promise I'm not here to shove a microphone in your face. I believed her. What do you want? She hesitated. The hospital asked if I'd tell you something. The hospital? The little girl you pulled from the sedan. I felt my stomach tighten. Is she? Emily smiled. She's going to be okay. I closed my eyes. Thank God. Her parents wanted you to know she's asking about the man who broke the window. A laugh escaped me before I could stop it. I imagine her parents have told her not to climb through broken windows. Emily smiled. They also asked if you'd visit someday. Maybe. I'll tell them. She started to leave, then turned back. There are about 20 reporters outside. I sighed. I figured. They don't know you're here. Let's keep it that way. You have my word. She walked away. For the first time since all this began, I felt there was still such a thing as decent journalism. Meanwhile, Brian hadn't slept. Neither had Melissa. At 7 that morning, they met outside my house. The house where they had both grown up. The house Linda had loved. Brian unlocked the front door using the emergency key I'd given him years earlier. Everything looked exactly the same. Linda's favorite rocking chair still faced the front window. My old work boots sat neatly beside the garage door. The smell of fresh coffee was gone. For over 40 years, Linda had started every morning before I woke. Now the kitchen felt strangely hollow. Melissa quietly walked to the dining room. There was still a small vase sitting in the center of the table. Inside were dried lavender flowers. Our anniversary, she whispered. Brian looked over. What? Mom always put fresh lavender here before their anniversary. Neither of them spoke for nearly a minute. The silence inside that house seemed louder than words. We should straighten things up before Dad comes home, Melissa finally said. Brian nodded. It gave them something to do besides think. As Melissa dusted bookshelves in the living room, she noticed an old cedar chest tucked beneath the staircase. She frowned. I've never seen this. Brian walked over. It's Mom's. The lid wasn't locked. Inside were photo albums, letters, and 6 leather-bound journals. Each one had a year written neatly across the front in Linda's handwriting. Melissa carefully picked up the newest one. I don't think we should. Brian looked away. I think Mom would have wanted us to. He wasn't sure. Neither of them was. Still. Melissa slowly opened the journal. The first few pages contained ordinary memories. Family dinners, vacation plans, birthdays. Then everything changed. One entry stopped both of them cold. Richard sold his fishing boat today. Brian thinks we still have it. I begged Richard not to tell him why. He used every dollar to help with the down payment on Brian's first house. Brian would never accept it if he knew. Brian's face went pale. No! Melissa turned another page, another entry. Melissa's divorce attorney needed another payment today. Richard quietly withdrew money from the retirement account. He smiled afterward and told the children we'd been thinking about downsizing anyway. Sometimes love sounds like a joke told to hide a sacrifice. Melissa covered her mouth. What? I thought they really wanted a smaller house. Brian slowly sat down. So did I. They kept reading, page after page, year after year. Every journal revealed another quiet sacrifice. Richard accepted consulting projects after retirement, not because he was bored, but because Brian's business had nearly failed. Richard postponed replacing his aging truck because Melissa's oldest daughter needed braces. Richard skipped vacations because college tuition kept increasing. Never once had he complained. Never once had he asked to be repaid. Then Melissa found an entry written only 4 months earlier. She read it aloud through tears. The doctors in Vancouver believe there's one more treatment available. Richard insisted we try. He withdrew almost everything left in our retirement savings today. He smiled while signing the papers, but I know exactly what it cost him. If I don't survive, I pray the children never mistake his quietness for indifference. Beneath that silence is the biggest heart I've ever known. Brian leaned forward with both elbows on his knees. His shoulders began shaking. I thought, his voice cracked, I thought Dad was just careful with money. Melissa wiped tears from her cheeks. So did I. Neither of them had ever asked why I kept driving a 12-year-old pickup, or why I wore the same winter coat every season, or why I always said, I'm doing just fine. They had simply accepted it, because acceptance requires far less effort than curiosity. Around noon, Karen arrived carrying sandwiches. She immediately sensed something was wrong. What happened? Brian handed her one of Linda's journals. She read only 3 pages. Then she quietly sat beside her husband. I'm so sorry. Brian stared at the floor. I told him to take an Uber. Karen reached for his hand. I know. My mother had just been buried. I know. I didn't even ask if he was okay. Karen squeezed his fingers. What matters now is what you do next. Brian looked toward the front door. I don't even know where he is. Across the city, I sat alone on a bench overlooking Elliott Bay. The breeze carried the smell of salt water. Linda loved this view. She used to say the ferries reminded her that life was always carrying someone home. I smiled sadly. Then my phone rang again. This time, I answered. Hello. For several seconds, Brian couldn't speak. Finally, through quiet tears, I heard just 4 words. Dad, come home. Brian's voice stayed with me long after the call ended. Dad, come home. 4 simple words. Words I'd wanted to hear 24 hours earlier. Words that arrived just a little too late. I hadn't hung up on him. I hadn't yelled. I hadn't even asked why he suddenly cared. I simply said, I'm not ready yet. Then I ended the call. Not to punish him. To protect myself. There are times when your heart has been stretched so thin that even forgiveness needs a little room to breathe. I spent the afternoon walking along Seattle's waterfront. The ferries moved slowly across Elliott Bay carrying commuters who looked just like they had every other weekday. People hurried toward meetings. Tourists took pictures. Street musicians played guitars near Pike Place Market. Life never pauses because one family falls apart. Linda understood that better than anyone. Whenever something difficult happened, she'd squeeze my hand and say, the world keeps turning, Richard. We have to decide whether we'll keep walking with it. I wasn't sure I knew how anymore. Every corner of Seattle reminded me of her. The bakery where she always insisted on buying cinnamon rolls. The bookstore where she'd disappear for an hour and come back carrying 3 novels she swore she didn't need. The little seafood restaurant overlooking the water where we'd celebrated our 40th anniversary. Every memory felt beautiful. Every memory hurt. My phone rang again. This time it wasn't Brian. It was Emily Harper, the reporter. I answered. Yes. I thought we agreed no interviews. We did. So why are you calling? There was a pause. Because I'm not calling for television. I waited. The mayor wants to present you with an award. I'm not interested. I figured. The governor's office also called. No. The fire department. No. The hospital. I already know the little girl survived. She did. Another pause. There's one more request. What is it? I'd like to tell the story correctly. I smiled despite myself. Correctly. Right now, every station is calling you a hero. I don't feel like one. I know. Then why interview me? Because people are guessing. I stayed quiet. They're inventing stories about why you were at the airport alone. They don't need to know. I think they do. Why? Because loneliness is something a lot of people understand. That answer surprised me. She continued gently. My father died alone in a nursing home during COVID. I closed my eyes. I'm sorry. I never got to say goodbye. I'm truly sorry. I've spent 4 years wishing I'd had one more conversation. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, she asked, would you consider one interview, no politics? Never. No dramatic music. She laughed softly. I promise. No attacking my children. I wouldn't allow it. I thought about Linda. She believed stories should heal whenever possible. One interview. Thank you. One condition. Anything. If I don't like a question, you don't answer it. Exactly. The interview took place the following morning inside a quiet conference room at Harborview Medical Center. No audience, no bright stage lights, just 2 chairs, a small camera, Emily and me. Before filming started, she looked at me and smiled. Nervous? A little. So am I. That made me laugh. Good. The producer counted down. 3, 2, 1. The camera light turned red. Emily began. Mr. Bennett, millions of people have watched the footage from the airport. I've heard. They've called you brave. I think the firefighters were brave. They say you ran toward danger while everyone else ran away. I saw people who needed help. Weren't you afraid? I looked down at my bandaged hands. Of course. So why keep going back? I thought about Linda, about 42 years together, about hospitals, chemotherapy, long nights, holding her hand while she slept. When you've spent 42 years loving one person, my voice cracked. Fear stops mattering as much. Emily didn't interrupt. You spend enough time watching someone fight for life. I swallowed hard. And you stop asking whether something is dangerous. You start asking whether someone needs you. The room became very quiet. Even the cameraman lowered his eyes. Emily carefully moved to another question. We understand you had just returned from Canada. Yes. You buried your wife. I did. I'm sorry. Thank you. She hesitated, then asked the question that changed everything. Did your family know you were coming home? I knew exactly what millions of viewers were wondering. This was my chance. I could tell them about the text messages. I could repeat every painful word. I could let the entire country judge my children. Instead, I smiled. They have busy lives. Emily waited. I continued. They're raising families. They're working. They're trying to balance more responsibilities than I ever had at their age. So, they couldn't come. I shrugged gently. Life gets complicated. She studied me for several seconds. You don't sound angry. I've had enough sadness this week. There was no reason to add anger to it. The interview ended shortly afterward. Emily stood and quietly hugged me. I hope my dad would have answered like that. I hope he would have had the chance. She wiped away a tear before walking toward the control room. By noon, the interview was airing across Washington, then Oregon, then California. By evening, it was being shared nationwide, not because I'd rescued strangers, but because of one sentence. They have busy lives. Comment sections exploded. Thousands of people wrote that the sentence hurt more than any accusation ever could. One woman posted, "My father says this every time I forget to call him." Another wrote, "I just booked a flight to visit my parents." A retired Marine commented, "The strongest men are often the quietest." The interview reached millions. Brian watched it alone in his office. When I smiled and defended him, he buried his face in his hands. "I don't deserve that," he whispered. Melissa watched from her living room. Her youngest daughter climbed onto the couch. "Mom." "Yes." "Why is Grandpa saying nice things?" Melissa couldn't answer. Her daughter looked confused. "If someone hurt my feelings," she said innocently, "I don't think I'd protect them." Melissa began crying harder. Neither would most adults. That's what made my answer so painful. That evening, my front porch filled with flowers. Neighbors left handwritten notes. Veterans placed small American flags beside the walkway. The family next door mowed my lawn without saying a word. Someone shoveled fresh mulch into Linda's flower beds. Nobody rang the doorbell. They simply helped. Across the street, old Mr. Jensen told a television crew, "Richard's been taking care of this neighborhood for 30 years. "What do you mean? He fixed roofs after storms, checked on widows during snowstorms, never accepted a dime," the reporter asked. "Did anyone know?" Mr. Jensen smiled sadly. "Richard wasn't the kind of man who announced kindness." Late that night, I finally drove home. The house looked exactly as I'd left it, except for one thing. On the front porch sat two lawn chairs. Brian occupied one. Melissa occupied the other. Neither was looking at a phone. Neither spoke when I stepped out of my truck. They simply stood, waiting. For the first time in years, they had nowhere else they needed to be. For several seconds, none of us moved. Brian stood on the left side of the porch. Melissa stood on the right. The porch light cast long shadows across the front yard, making them look younger somehow. Not because they had changed overnight, because for the first time in years, I could see uncertainty on their faces. Parents spend most of their lives watching uncertainty disappear from their children. We teach them to ride bicycles, to drive, to balance checkbooks, to make decisions. Then one day they're grown confident, successful, and you quietly hope they still remember how to need you. I picked up my suitcase from the truck. Brian immediately stepped forward. "Dad, let me get that." I looked at him. For a moment, I almost said no. Instead, I handed him the handle. He carried it inside without another word. It struck me then. The last time he'd carried one of my bags, he was probably 12 years old. Melissa walked over carefully as though she were afraid I might disappear if she moved too quickly. "I made coffee," I smiled faintly. Your mother's recipe. She nodded. I found it in her cookbook. Does it taste the same? She laughed through tears. Not even close. That made both of us smile. It was the first genuine smile I'd managed since Linda died. Inside the house felt familiar again. The flowers neighbors had left covered nearly every countertop. Cards, letters, homemade cookies. A knitted blanket from the church Linda had attended for years. I quietly looked around. You've been cleaning. Melissa lowered her eyes. We wanted you to come home to a clean house. It looks nice. Brian swallowed hard. We also found Mom's journals. I looked toward the dining room. I wondered when that day would come. You knew, of course. You let us read them. They belonged to your mother. He nodded slowly. We didn't know. I know. No, Dad, his voice cracked. I mean, we really didn't know. I understood exactly what he meant. We sat around the dining room table, the same table where Linda had served Thanksgiving dinner for 4 decades. No television, no phones, just 3 cups of coffee. Melissa reached into her purse and carefully placed one of Linda's journals on the table. I've read every page. So have I, Brian admitted. Neither looked at me. Brian finally spoke. I thought you liked working after retirement. I liked staying busy. But that's not why you did it. No, you paid my mortgage. You needed help. You sold your boat. It was only a boat. It was Grandpa's boat. I smiled. I still have the memories. Brian shook his head. I would have never accepted the money. I know. So why didn't you tell me? Because helping you wasn't supposed to become another burden. Silence settled over the room again. Melissa wiped away another tear. I thought you wanted to downsize. Your mother wanted you to keep your dignity after the divorce. I would have figured something out. You did. Because of you. I nodded. She covered her face. I kept thinking about my text. I didn't answer. Dad, you should have planned better. Her shoulders began shaking. I actually wrote that. You did. I would do anything to erase it. I reached across the table, placed my hand gently over hers. You can't. She looked at me. But you can decide who you become after it. Brian stood and walked toward the kitchen window. For a long time, he simply stared into the backyard. I've been trying to understand something. What? When that reporter asked whether we knew you were coming home? Yes, you could have destroyed us. I suppose. You could have told everyone exactly what happened. I could have. So why didn't you? I thought about Linda again. Every answer still seemed to begin with her. Because public humiliation doesn't heal private wounds. Neither of them spoke. I continued. If millions of strangers hated you, would Mom have wanted that? Brian slowly shook his head. No. No. Linda believed accountability should lead somewhere, not simply leave people broken. Melissa quietly asked, Were you angry? I laughed softly. Of course I was. You didn't look angry. I've had practice. She frowned. Practice? When you're married for 42 years, I smiled, you learn that speaking while angry usually creates another problem to solve tomorrow. Brian actually laughed. Mom used to say you disappeared into the garage whenever you got upset. I organized screws, Melissa blinked. What? The coffee cans. The ones labeled 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch, 3/4 inch. Brian suddenly smiled. You weren't organizing anything. No. What were you doing? Waiting until I could answer kindly. The room became quiet again. Melissa whispered, I wish I'd learned that sooner. It's not too late. A few days later, we drove together to the cemetery. Linda's ashes had been placed in the memorial garden overlooking Puget Sound, exactly where she'd asked. The 3 of us stood there with fresh white lilies. Brian finally spoke. I'm sorry, Mom. Melissa nodded. I forgot how much you both carried. The wind moved gently through the trees. I almost expected Linda to tell us we were standing too close together. She always joked that family pictures looked better if everyone spread out. Instead, there was only silence. A peaceful silence. Not empty, just full of memories. Brian looked at me. I've spent years assuming you'd always be there. I hoped I would. I never stopped to think that someday you might need us. I placed the flowers beside Linda's marker. Parents spend most of their lives teaching children to walk. I looked at both of them. The hardest lesson is teaching them to walk back. Brian broke down completely. He wrapped both arms around me. It wasn't the quick, awkward hug adult sons often give their fathers. It was the desperate embrace of a little boy who had finally realized how close he'd come to losing the man who had quietly held his life together. Melissa joined us. The three of us stood there crying beneath the tall evergreens while the afternoon sun broke through the clouds. For the first time since Linda's funeral, I didn't feel completely alone. That evening, Brian surprised me. He canceled a business trip. Melissa rearranged her work schedule. Neither announced it. Neither asked for praise. They simply stayed. We ordered pizza, played cards the way Linda loved. The grandchildren ran through the backyard laughing until sunset. I watched them from the porch. Brian sat beside me. Dad. Yes. I can't change what I texted. No. But I can spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to read anything like that again. I looked at my son, then at my daughter playing with her children on the lawn. People often imagine revenge as the moment someone finally gets even. But sitting there, I realized the greatest revenge against neglect wasn't punishment. It was watching the people who had forgotten your worth finally learn to value your presence before it was too late. And that was beginning to happen. People often think healing happens all at once. It doesn't. It arrives quietly, one ordinary day at a time. A week after Linda's memorial service, I woke before sunrise just as I had for most of my adult life. For a few seconds, I reached toward the other side of the bed again. It was still empty. Some habits outlive the people we love. Instead of letting the silence swallow me, I got dressed, made coffee, and stepped onto the back porch. The garden was glowing under the soft morning light. Linda's roses were blooming. She used to tell me they didn't bloom because of her gardening skills. They bloom because somebody takes the time to notice them. I smiled. Maybe people weren't so different. At exactly 8 o'clock, I heard a truck pull into the driveway. It was Brian. Not because something had broken. Not because he needed money, not because he wanted advice. He simply walked onto the porch carrying 2 cups of coffee. I figured yours would be cold by now, he said. I laughed. You figured right. He sat beside me without speaking. For several minutes, we watched birds hopping across the lawn. Finally, he broke the silence. I canceled my Wednesday morning meetings. You didn't have to. I know. I wanted to. That sentence meant more to me than he probably realized. When children are young, parents give them time because they have no choice. When children become adults, giving time becomes a choice. Brian had finally begun making that choice. Melissa changed too. Every Thursday evening, she stopped by after work. Sometimes she brought groceries. Sometimes she brought homemade soup that never tasted quite as good as Linda's. She admitted that herself. I still can't make your wife's chicken noodle soup. No one can. I even followed the recipe. I smiled. Your mother always left one ingredient out. What ingredient? Patience. Melissa laughed. That's not an ingredient. It was for her. Soon those Thursday dinners became something we all look forward to. No special occasions, no birthdays, just family sharing a meal. Something we should have never stopped doing. The grandchildren noticed the changes before anyone else. One Saturday afternoon, my oldest grandson Ethan wandered into my garage. He looked around at the shelves lined with tools. Dad says you built almost everything in this house. Most of it. Can you teach me? Those 3 words filled a place inside my heart I hadn't realized had become empty. For the next several hours, we worked side by side, building a simple birdhouse. He measured twice, cut once, missed a nail, laughed, tried again. By sunset, the birdhouse leaned slightly to one side. It isn't perfect, Ethan said. I placed my hand on his shoulder. Neither are families. He looked at me. But if the foundation is strong, I tapped the little wooden house. It'll still stand. He smiled. I had a feeling he would remember that conversation long after he forgot how crooked the birdhouse had been. A month later, the Seattle Fire Department invited me to speak at a community emergency preparedness program. At first, I almost declined. Public speaking had never been my favorite thing. Then I remembered something Linda used to tell me. If your experience can help someone else, it's no longer just your story. So I accepted. The room was filled with retirees, young parents, college students, and first responders. When it was my turn, I didn't spend much time talking about the airport accident. Instead, I talked about preparation, about staying calm, about learning basic first aid, about looking after your neighbors. Then near the end, a man in the audience raised his hand. What made you run toward those cars? The room became quiet. I thought carefully before answering. My wife spent 2 years teaching me something. What was that? She taught me that every extra minute matters. I paused. When someone you love is fighting for life, you stop wasting time pretending someone else will help. The audience remained silent for several seconds. Then they stood. Not because of me, because they understood. Life slowly found a new rhythm. Brian began bringing his family over every Sunday afternoon. Melissa stopped calling only when she needed something. Instead, she'd phone just to ask, "What are you doing?" Sometimes my answer was watching baseball. Other times, fixing the fence, or simply thinking about your mother. Those conversations became longer, warmer, real. One evening, Brian surprised me again. He handed me a small envelope. Inside was a receipt. "The retirement account," he said. I looked up. "What about it?" "I'm paying back every dollar you spent helping me." I gently pushed the envelope back toward him. "You don't owe me anything." "I do." "No, I want to." I smiled. "Then spend it on your children." He frowned. "What?" "Take them camping. Travel together. Create memories." "That's a better investment than paying me back." His eyes filled with tears. "You really aren't going to let me repay you, are you?" "I already got paid." "How?" "You came back." A few months later, on what would have been Linda's 66th birthday, the whole family gathered in the backyard. The grandchildren chased each other between the rose bushes. Melissa made her best attempt at Linda's apple pie. It still wasn't quite right. We laughed about it. Brian grilled hamburgers exactly the way I had taught him years before. As the sun began to set, everyone grew quiet. Brian stood and lifted a glass of iced tea. "I'd like to say something." No one interrupted. He looked at me. "Dad." He took a deep breath. "For years, I believed success meant providing for my family." He glanced toward his wife and son. "I forgot that my family also included the man who spent his entire life providing for me." His voice trembled. "I can never take back that text message." He looked down for a moment before meeting my eyes again. "But I promise you'll never have to wonder again whether someone is coming to pick you up." Melissa reached over and held my hand. "So do I." I looked around the table, at my children, my grandchildren, at the empty chair we had intentionally left for Linda, not because we believed she was physically there, but because love has a way of remaining present even after goodbye. I smiled. "I think your mother would be happy." Brian laughed softly. "No, she'd tell us the burgers are burning." Everyone laughed. It felt wonderful. Not because the pain was gone, because joy had finally found enough room to sit beside it. As I grow older, I've learned that families are rarely broken by one terrible moment. They're slowly pulled apart by small moments of neglect, missed phone calls, unanswered messages, postponed visits, the quiet assumption that there will always be another chance. Sometimes there isn't. If this story reminded you of someone who once waited for your call, maybe today is the right day to reach out. Tell them you love them. Visit while you still can. Don't wait until regret becomes the loudest voice in the room. And if this story touched your heart, please consider sharing it with someone who needs the reminder that the greatest gift we can give the people we love isn't money or success. It's our time. Thank you for spending yours with me.